So, do you have a designated worrier in your family or workplace? Someone who's always thinking ahead to what might go wrong, right? Well, in my family growing up, that was my mom. That was her role. She was always kind of, before we left on a trip, making the lists of all the things we might forget or making sure we were all managed to get out of the house on time. I think even today, sometimes we gather as a family and we're finishing a meal and she's already worried about, the logistics for the next one, right? So I live in Minnesota and she lives down in Santa Cruz. And sometimes I'll get texts from her and she'll say, well, are you ready for the storm? And I'd say, what storm? And she's tracking on a weather app, the weather in Minneapolis and, worrying, fretting about it, right? So it's easy sometimes, right, to fret and to worry and to be anxious. There's lots of things to be anxious about, right, in our world today or in our churches, right, as well. I get worried sometimes as well. We all, of course, carry these little devices around with us that have apps on them that foment all kinds of fear and worry and rage and all of those emotions. So it's pretty much part of life, right? Part of life. Well, of all the things you can say about Jesus, one of the things that I think is pretty hard to say about him is that he was worried. So think about all the stories of Jesus. He doesn't seem very worried. And, remember that moment where he's in the boat with the disciples and they're crossing the Sea of Galilee, and there's like this huge storm and there's waves crashing and their disciples are freaking out. They're like trying to bail water out of the boat. And he's just like sleeping through it all, right? Not at all worried. Why was that? Why was that, right? I think it's because Jesus lived in a profound, trusting relationship with God, right? That was the core of that kind of posture. So in our gospel that we just heard, the disciples say to him, increase our faith, increase our faith. And when we heard that word faith in the Bible, it's important that we recognize it's not about kind of believing a certain set of ideas about God as much as it is kind of what do we place our trust in? What do we set our hearts upon? That's probably a better way to think about it, right? For that word faith. And one of the great themes of the Bible, from beginning to end, is God's people being called by God and created by God to trust in God and to follow God, and God's people struggling to do that, right? And I think for us in today's world, in the modern West, modern Western culture, I think it's particularly hard to do that because we live in a culture that forms us to seek the good without God. Can you hear me? There we go. To seek the good without God. I mean, in some sense, modern culture's basic wager or bet was that you can live a good life without religion, without God, right? And we can do it all on our own. And so that leaves us having to rely on our own strength. And when things are going awry, or when we're facing suffering or resistance or violence, that can be a cause indeed of anxiety. So I want to begin by digging a bit into our reading the first reading we heard from Habakkuk, right? So this, one of the minor prophets. I don't know how much time you spend reading Habakkuk in the Bible, but perhaps not, probably not maybe not your favorite book. I don't get to preach on Habakkuk very often, so I'm taking my chance here. So Habakkuk was a prophet who lived in the 7th century in a time when the people of Israel were actually facing siege, essentially from the Babylonians. So there was real violence and existential threat that they were confronted with. And so we hear from the prophet at the beginning of this book saying, "Oh Lord, how long shall I cry for help? And you will not listen," right? There's violence. Help. Where's the justice, right? And they're Those are thoughts we might have today as well, right? And Psalm 37 also has this similar theme about, don't fret because of the wicked, right? It's a given that there are people doing crazy things in the world, right? Not under our control. Put your trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land. Again, hard for the people in Habakkuk's day, in the psalmist's day, and I think particularly hard for us today. So part of the anxiety and craziness that I think is happening in American culture at the moment is that I think it's seeming less and less plausible that we can achieve peace and harmony and human flourishing for everyone and justice and all those things on our own, right? In fact, if anything, it seems like the more uprooted we are as a culture from the sacred roots that we have, the more crazy things get. So James Davison Hunter, who's a professor at the University of Virginia, he says that, American society for its history has been held together by two primary narratives, two stories. And one of these is the biblical, story and the traditions from Judaism and Christianity. And the other story is the story of liberal democracy coming out of the Enlightenment. And there is a kind of consensus, or at least that's what holds us together as society. But I think more and more people in our world today are doubting or disbelieving or rejecting both of those narratives. And so what we're left with is a will to power. Who can take power and wield it over others, right? So Habakkuk says, look at the proud. Their spirit is not right in them. Isn't that an interesting way to frame it? Their spirit is not right in them. And I think there's something in contemporary American society where the spirit is not right in us. And it comes out in all kinds of crazy ways. Perhaps you feel like the spirit is not right in you, right? So where do we turn? Habakkuk gets up on the city walls, the ramparts, and keeps watch for God, right? Expects God to show up and to give a promise. To have a vision, right? That was not just something that would be spoken, but would actually be written on tablets. And not just written on tablets, but written like on a billboard of tablets, big enough letters that a runner from a distance could see it, right? And that vision is that God will act in history, that God's promises are sure and true, that it's not all up to us, no matter what enemies surround us, and that the righteous, those who live in right relationship with God and others, will live by their faithfulness, by their trust. So what does that mean then for us to trust in God today? Jesus says to his disciples, even if you have a tiny little bit of faith, it'll be enough to, cast a tree up into the sea, right? Kind of a crazy idea, crazy metaphor that Jesus uses. Really, I think to make that point that small faith even is transformational and can change the world. 2 Timothy has this wonderful discussion where Paul's reminding Timothy about the intergenerational faith passed down from his grandmother Lois to his mother Eunice, and then to him as a young man, right? That this faith gets stewarded across generations as God's promises are shared, right? And we're formed in them. And then Psalm 37:7, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Hard sometimes to wait patiently, isn't it? Do not fret over those who prosper in their way, over those who carry out evil devices. Be still, rest, abide, dwell in the love and presence of God. How do we do that in a moment where technology is forming us constantly to be perpetually distracted, to be uneasy and to react, right, all the time, mean, we are engaging a civilization-wide experiment with rewiring our brains, right, to react to these digital devices. And I might say it's not always going well, right? The impact of that, right? How might we be grounded differently and offer a different witness? So that word dwell that we hear, the word that Jesus uses around abiding, I think those are helpful terms for us to lean into. As I was driving up on Friday, I noticed on your church sign you have a quotation from John 15 about the vine and the branches. That passage in John's gospel where Jesus is telling his disciples, inviting them to be rooted, have their lives rooted like branches in the vine that is Jesus. Right? Very appropriate for this area, of course, with all your vineyards. And what does it mean for us, both personally and as a community, to abide and be rooted in a time when I think our society is increasingly uprooted, right? I think it means claiming some practices that go way back deep into the Christian tradition and even before that into the Jewish tradition, things like Sabbath. So to take a day off from work and trust that the world will keep going, it won't collapse because you're not holding it up, right? Is a freeing practice, right? It is Sabbath that actually makes us free when we realize we can rest in the love and presence and energy of God. Practices like silence and solitude, putting away our devices, focusing on one another, these are things that our society seems to be losing, and thus the anxiety increases. So the psalmist says, refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. So when you are tempted by whatever you're seeing on social media or on the news to just, jump in with your anger and your wrath against whoever it is, right? Take a deep breath. It's an opportunity to step back and to trust. Jesus' way is a way of peace that comes in part through interrupting the cycles of vengeance and retribution. And the most powerful instance of that is the cross, right? So if so often in history, those who are victimized turn around and, lash out against others, and there's this cycle of contempt, right, and violence that continues, Jesus interrupts that on the cross by entering into it and saying, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. He offers us a way out from that cycle that I think our society is increasingly caught in. There are conflict entrepreneurs who are making a lot of money off of our rage, right? Who have every incentive simply to keep stoking it, right? For us as a community of followers of Jesus to interrupt that and to be people of peace and freedom and Sabbath, right? And trust is to live an alternative story that I think our world needs right now. So when the psalmist says, dwell in the land, I think that's another hopeful message for us too. That's about being rooted where we are. Wherever God has placed us in the daily relationships that we have with our neighbors, our family, our friends, all those around us, where again, we can in small and organic ways give witness to an alternative story. We can perform acts of sacrificial service and love. We can risk loving our enemies. And we can avoid getting caught in the culture of self-justification that we live in today, where people are always trying to prove themselves in whatever ways, right? The good news is we don't need to prove ourselves. God has claimed and called all of us unconditionally. And there's nothing you can do to earn God's favor or to lose it, right? So our opportunity is simply to trust in that reality. And when we trust in it, we're free then to love others in that same way. We can abide. like branches in the vine. Increase our faith. That's the disciples' request to Jesus, and I think it's a good one for us to lean into as well. Increase our faith, increase our trust in a moment where everything says don't trust. And I think the trust has to be placed in the right place, which is God, right? So all through the biblical narrative, God's people sometimes often go awry when they place their trust in people, leaders, things, money, whatever it is, that is not actually ultimate. So as we bring this message to a close, I want to lead us in a very simple prayer that comes a couple chapters later in the Psalms, from Psalm 46, verse 10. And that's a line in that psalm that will probably be familiar to you. It's simply, be still and know that I am God. And I'm going to lead us in a just meditative prayer of that line. So I invite you simply to take a deep breath, close your eyes, settle yourself as we pray. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am. Be still and know. Be still. Be.